Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate your attendance here this evening, and I hope I will inform you, entertain you. I will probably shock you, because there's some shocking things that happened. I'm glad there's not children in the audience, because I'll do some cussing, swearing. Not that I'm by that nature do that way, but history so deemed that you will hear it. Just repeating what happened in history. Next year is the 50th anniversary of Neil Armstrong's flight to the moon and stepping on the moon. The noted physicist Stephen Hawking declared that when Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, it was the most significant event in the history of human history. The space program, as I tell you the story and my involvement, you really have to look at the history of the space race as a Cold War adventure. We were racing the Soviet Union to the moon. And I'm glad I don't have young people, because young people don't even know what the Soviet Union is. They said, what do you mean? Where is that? What country is that? Oh, Russia? Do you mean Russia? I've had that before when I've talked to young people. They have no concept of history. In fact, an aside here, I gave the graduation address at the Florence High School in 2012, and I started off with a joke. I said, I've been to commencement programs before, and I know as students you want to get the hell out of here. So I will quote from the King Henry VIII when he told one of his wives, I'm not going to keep you long. There wasn't one twitter, one laugh, one giggle. And later on, somebody said, you know, they don't teach about Henry VIII anymore. They don't teach any of that stuff in history. So anyhow, let me take this. We had, in talking about the space program, we had an open space program, which meant that the public and the press could see what we were doing. We had press people in all briefing them and so forth, where in the Soviet Union, there was nothing of this, of the kind. When Yuri Gagarin made the first human flight around the Earth, one orbit, the Soviet Union didn't say a word about it till he was safely on the ground and alive. There's reason to believe that there may have been some guys that tried it and that never made it, and they didn't kept that hushed up. That didn't happen in the US. And as I later on will talk about a flying saucer incident, that openness kind of bit us in the behind. I'm going to give you the presentation that basically I gave at the 44th commemoration of the lunar landing that was held at the Space Foundation 5 years ago, where they charged $15 a person. You're hearing this for free. I'll tell you about what I will be talking about. I'm going to talk about the Mercury 7, the original astronauts, the country's heroes. Then I'll talk about the President Kennedy's challenge to land a man on the moon and bring him back safely, which involved forming a new space center, which we're moving to, or which I moved to. The next group of astronauts, the new 9, Gemini had a flying saucer incident. I'll talk about my involvement in that. Apollo 8, the first time we sent people to the moon was not Apollo 11 when Neil Armstrong landed. It was on Apollo 8 that happened to launch on Christmas Eve the year before, 1968. The Apollo program was in a crisis for reasons I'll explain, and my role in getting us through that crisis. The first lunar landing, exciting moment for me and I'm sure everybody here in the country. And I'll close it with some obscure facts about the space program. I hope to inform you on all these, and I know you will probably have questions. I'll try to make this presentation less than an hour so we have time at the end for questions. Oh,
yeah, a little bit farther away.
Maybe I'll leave it right here then. Okay, how's that?
A little bit closer.
How's that? Okay. The Mercury 7 astronauts featured here in Life magazine. Great bunch of guys. They were all military test pilots. We didn't know how the human body would react in space. So they were guinea pigs. They also, being military test pilots, they were used to working under pressure, having to take control in situations that could be catastrophic. So there was a lot of early discussion about what are the right people to be astronauts. There was quite a push to have submarine naval officers to be, because they're going to be in a confined capsule, space capsule. I happened to be, when I transferred from aeronautical research with NACA, they later become NASA, to the space program. Actually, I went to work for the Space Task Group. That was before NASA was, that was during the process of the formation of NASA. I happened to be in my whoops, sorry, got the wrong thing. I happened to be in my mid-20s, and here I was thrown in with the astronauts because my area of expertise, so to speak, was on launch vehicles, the rockets, and they were very concerned about that, and I would go to meetings with the astronauts to review the progress of the Atlas rocket that they were going to ride on. Life magazine did a weekly series on all aspects of their life. They, the 7 astronauts, had a private contract with Life magazine to talk about their private lives, their families, and so forth. But they were not, Life magazine was not on this, at the Space Center covering their training and so forth. It turns out Life magazine, growing up in the 1940s, was my television. There, we got a weekly magazine, and you would see these beautiful pictures of things, and World War II was going on. See all these pictures of the wars. So it was the Life magazine articles and the newspaper articles were really generating a lot of public interest. There was, I think, an adoring public. I was at a meeting at Los Angeles Air Force Station back in the early 60s. And I happened to be also going, I was also assigned to attend the meetings that we were having on a rocket review, the Atlas rocket. And I ended up at the lounge in the Thunderbird Hotel next to LAX airport with 4 of the astronauts, in a booth, and we were talking and having drinks and just palavering. And I had to get up and go to the restroom. So I got up and I discovered the hotel had put up a cordon to keep this vast number of people that were in the lobby of the hotel to coming into the lounge. We had the lounge to ourselves. So I kind of pushed my way through the crowd, and a woman stuck an autograph book in my face and said, "I want your autograph." And I said, "You don't want my autograph." And her husband looked at me and said, "You sign that book." And I did. I'm sure out later said, "Well, who the hell, which one of the astronauts is Marlowe Casetti?" So that was an interesting excitement. Also, on a different time, I was having a breakfast with them at a restaurant, and the talk was all about who was going to be the first man on the moon. Of all these 7 gentlemen, only one went to the moon. The others didn't, for various and sundry reasons. Alan Shepard was on a later Apollo mission, and you might have remembered him. He was an avid golfer. He hit a golf ball on the moon and said it went miles. Also, at the time we were having that breakfast, there was a public announcement of the next group of astronauts selected, and the conversation that was going on at our breakfast table was such that, you know, why do we need more astronauts? We can go to the moon. We got enough guys here. 7's plenty, right? While we're talking about the Mercury program, because that's what many of these astronauts flew on, was in the Mercury capsule on top of either the Redstone rocket or the Atlas rocket for the Earth orbit missions. Here's something that happened to me, witnessed by me. And it was while I was working at Cape Canaveral, Florida, getting ready for the Mercury 8 mission. It was the day before the mission. The place, Cocoa Beach, Florida, which is the public area near the launch area, was jammed full of press and spectators. So we went after work, we went to Fat Boy's Barbecue, very good barbecue place in Cocoa Beach, Florida. And while we were there, we had 4 guys that I worked with that we ate our dinner and we got ready to leave. The place was packed. We had to wait a while to get seated, ate, so forth. And as I was leaving to get in line to pay our bill, the owner, who was an older woman, I should say that when you're 25 years old, anybody that's in their 40s or 30s or 40s, they're old people. So she was quite a character, but she was arguing with this man in line, the one right in front of me, and they were really having this furious argument. I couldn't make it out, but the place was crowded. It was a noisy environment. And as the man finally paid his bill and walked to my left, I saw that was Walter Cronkite. Why is he having this big argument with the owner, the cashier owner? So I said, she said, "Okay, give me your money and your bill." So I give her that, and I said, "Was that Walter Cronkite?" She said, "That son of a bitch is always trying to get a free meal here. I don't like it. He's got money, he can buy a meal. Why is he trying to rip us off?" So, okay. So I'm walking, I was the one who had to rent a car, so these other guys pile in the car. Well, Don, the guy behind me, heard some of this, and I said, "Did you know that was Walter Cronkite?" He says, "Yeah, it looked like him. I thought that was him." Well, the other two guys were a little bit further back in line. They didn't have any clue. So we're driving, leaving the Fat Boys, and we're arguing about whether that was Walter Cronkite or not. Well, in the evenings in Cocoa Beach, the hot spot to go to was the lounge at the Holiday Inn. That was probably the nicest hotel there on the beach, and it was also the most popular. Now, us government employees couldn't afford to be there in the Holiday Inn. We had to stay in some flea bags, I'll call them. But the Holiday Inn was a really nice new hotel. So we go to there, and the place is jammed. One of the guys in our group managed to worm his way to the bar and got a stool at the bar. So we all kind of congregated around him, talking about the Walter Cronkite caper. And the bartender said, "Well, what's going on?" So the guy sitting at the bar explained to him about him trying to beat Fat Boys out of a bill. And he said, "That dirty son of a gun." He says, "He is not allowed in the lounge at the Holiday Inn. He's a persona non grata because he tries to mooch drinks and meals off of the patrons. He's a pest." It says he's not allowed in the lounge. He's staying here at the hotel, by the way, but he's not allowed in the lounge. That was very interesting because not a few years later, he was declared the most trusted man in America. Well, now we're going to the moon. President Kennedy declared his vision of us putting a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. And he made this point, and I'll quote from him: "We chose to go to the moon. We chose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." Now, one of the things I'm going to touch on is the moon hoax. People in the moon hoax use this as one of the reasons why we didn't land on the moon, because that would have been way too hard to do. It would have been easier to have a fake set in Hollywood and pipe it back. And I beg to differ with them on that. When President Kennedy made that announcement, it was met in NASA by excitement. I can't believe he did that. And other people, among those, the people that I was working with to try to get John Glenn into orbit before the end of the year, just thought, that's crazy. We can't even get a guy into orbit. How are we going to get anybody to the moon? We amazed ourselves. Okay. With the announcement that we're going to put people on the moon, we also, along with it, said we need a new space center that's going to work on this. This new space center will be called the Manned Spacecraft Center. And there was a blue ribbon committee formed under the auspices of the Office of the President of the U.S. That blue ribbon committee was a site selection board. They looked at 20 candidate sites from around the country, and they had a list of the top three. The top three, starting with their number one choice, was Berkeley, California, which happens to be in this picture. One of their frequent demonstrations, and strangely enough, for free speech. Now they're demonstrating to have the speech restricted. But therein lies another story. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, by the act of the National Space Act, was the chairman of the president's the president's Space Council, and he was the decision executive for the site. And after he heard the 3 recommendations in order of preference, he turned to his folks and said, "That's really strange. Where in the world is Berkeley, Texas? Never heard of Berkeley, Texas. It must be up in the hill country somewhere, I don't know." And guess what? We ended up moving to Houston. And when I moved to Houston, I used to shave in the morning and listen to the radio, music or news or whatever it was. And one of the radio stations was saying, "Look out, Houston, look out, Moon, here comes Houston." What I found, though, in moving to Texas was that both President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson were not very popular. You kind of had to be careful what you said at a cocktail party. You would get sort of a pushback. And that's one of the reasons why the Kennedys were in Dallas in that fateful day in November, because there was indications that Texas, that I should point out to people, I'm sure most of them know, John Kennedy won the 1960 election by the thinnest margin in history up to that time. So, and he barely won the Electoral College. If Texas hadn't been on his side, he wouldn't have been president. And bringing Lyndon Johnson in as his vice president, I think, was very instrumental in that. So that was one of the reasons why they were in Texas. The other thing is we had a network of secretaries that knew everything. And they called around the offices, "The president's coming by our office in a half an hour." And that is because whenever the Kennedys would fly to Texas, whether they were going to Houston or Dallas, they would always fly to Galveston. And I remember asking somebody, why does he fly into Galveston when he's got these nice, beautiful airports in Houston and Dallas? And the interest is Galveston, Texas is a hotbed of the Democrats. That's the only reason he comes in there and drives. So we saw, the day before the assassination, we saw an open car on the Gulf Freeway come by our office. It wasn't speeding, it was at a respectable speed. And the top was down. There was Jack Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy waving to us as they drove by. One of the things I'm sure every one of us knows is, where were you when Kennedy was assassinated? I was coming back from lunch and people were all crowded around the radios, and first thing I heard was the president was wounded in Dallas. And my first reaction was, those people up in Dallas are crazy, because just a few days ago, General Walker, there was an assassination attempt on him, which happened to be Lee Harvey Oswald. Took a pot shot at him with his rifle, missed him. Anyway, one of the fellas that I worked with, he came up to me, he says, "Marlowe, can you give me a ride home? My wife can't pick me up at work and I need to get home. The kids were let home early." And I said, "Sure, no problem." And so I drove him home, pulled into his driveway. His wife came running out, tears streaming down her face. And I remember him telling her, "Yeah, I know that was a shock. The president was assassinated." She says, "No, it wasn't really that I'm crying about. It's the children." And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "In their school, the teachers came around to the principal came around to the classroom and said, 'I have the most wonderful news.'" And that, by the way, wasn't an exception, because on Kennedy's 50th anniversary of his assassination, one of the reporters on television said that he was in high school in Miami, Florida, and the same thing happened there. It was like, oh, great thing, we got rid of this president. So that was a real, I'll never forget that. I think I found that was a shock. Like I said, some of the things in this talk is going to be shocking. This is the second group of astronauts. They were called the New Nine. I had a role as flight instructor in as an instructor in flight mechanics. Well, what's flight mechanics, would you say? It's how to take a nut and bolt and fasten them together when you're in space. Well, it's not that kind of mechanics. Flight mechanics is a branch of physics that involves the forces on a body, whether it's a rocket ship, a spacecraft, an airplane, a motorboat, all the forces on that body that determines its path, its current path and its future path. So my area of expertise by the time the new group came on board was in the area of the launch vehicle. So I went through in 2 classes explaining all the things that were going on when the Titan rocket pushed a Gemini spacecraft into orbit. These were a great bunch of guys. I got to know them pretty well from my 2 classes, and then I went on to work with many of them on the Gemini program. These were all, again, test pilots. However, 2 of them were not military test pilots. All the others were military, in military service. They were active duty military, all except the guy on the left-hand side in the brown suit. His name is Elliot C. He was a commercial test pilot for General Electric, and the guy kneeling down second from the right, Neil Armstrong, was a NACA NASA test pilot who had already flown in a rocket ship, the X-15, rocket-powered test aircraft. Neil Armstrong really impressed me. I had some conversations with him, and then later on, when the Apollo program was on, we worked. I have some funny stories, but I won't go into all of them. I'm going to talk about an incident that happened that proves there was a government cover-up of flying saucers. Oh, by the way, in the 1960s, nobody really used the term UFO. It was flying discs or flying saucers, because that's what was reported in 1947, that Kenneth Arnold saw while he was flying a private airplane. Anyway, the term flying saucers was in vogue. The Gemini 1 was an unmanned test flight of the Gemini capsule sitting on top of a Titan II rocket. It was launched by a Titan II rocket, as I said, on April the 9th, 1964 from Cape Canaveral. And I was at Cape Canaveral, where we had Mission Control Center that we used for the Mercury program, we used for the first flight of Gemini, and thereafter it was moved to Houston, Texas, in the Mission Control Center there. After the launch, an unidentified object was reported flying in formation with our rocket. The upper stage of the rocket, which is here forward, up above, forward. That and the spacecraft were all joined together, did not separate by intention, and it flew into orbit. But this unidentified object was flying right alongside. Now, if you were a student of flight mechanics, you would realize anything in formation with any body that's in space has got to start off at the same point and the same velocity at some time or other. You just don't happen to circumstantially happen. So it certainly led to the idea that this object probably came from what we just shot into space. Now, one of the things I said, our openness kind of bit us in the behind, is that the reporters that were hearing all our voice loops said, "Tell us about the flying saucer." They knew there was a story there. The news media caught scent of something anomalous. Well, I won't go into all the details, but we had, unknown to me, on the east coast of the United States, I think it was there, but I didn't have need to know. But there was a radar, a top secret radar installation that could image by the radar what the shape of things were, size and shape. So they gave us a very detailed description of what this object was. Well, some of the time it looked like a trapezoidal figure, and then it became a circle and so forth. It was certainly the engine bell. The engine bell is the expansion part of the rocket. It's usually made of fairly light, flimsy material. And the Titan rocket had a history of the engine bell separating or falling off. So knowing this shape and size was an obvious conclusion, and since it had happened before, that it was the engine bell that fell off before it got into orbit. Now, there were two Cold War secrets involved here. One of them that we had an installation that I can't really talk about, but it could detect anything in orbit. And by the way, the Soviet Union was putting stuff in orbit, and guess what we built that thing for, was to find out what they were putting up there. So that we didn't want to reveal that we had that capability. The other Cold War secret was the Titan II was a missile that was being on standby in the US in places like North Dakota and Wyoming and so forth, in silos, ready to launch at the first press of the button to the Soviet Union. Wouldn't it be bad to let the Soviets know that our rockets are not very reliable? So of course we had to keep it covered up. We kept it under wraps. What did we tell the press? We tell them it was a strange blip on the radar, there was nothing to it. And they seemed to shrug it off too. At the time, which was in the early 60s, if you went to the UFO community, the people that were following that, and by the way, the UFO committee, the community, the flying saucer community, did not recognize that there was anything going on at Roswell, New Mexico. So I happened to be at a conference, a space conference in Albuquerque, where they let the public come in one day and see the displays and everything. And I was with one of the astronauts, and we got to talking about the Gemini program, and there was a civilian off the street who was kind of listening to this conversation, and he said, "You worked on Gemini?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Tell me about Gemini 1, where the government covered up the evidence." And I said, "Oh, that's a bunch of crap," and so forth. And he was really confrontational about it. So let's go back to the moon, and we're on Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was a strategic change in the mission. The mission had been laid out that we were going to do so much testing, but because the lunar module was in trouble with weight, reliability, and performance, we couldn't let it fly, not with people in it. We found out also from the CIA that the Soviet Union was planning on sending cosmonauts around the moon, similar to what we did on Apollo 8. And they could then claim, well, they really beat us to the moon. We didn't have to land on the moon to prove that. And this, my friends, is a schematic of the trajectory that we followed, except for the fact that when we got to the moon, we deorbited and flew around the moon several revolutions before returning. But the thing I'll point out, I was in mission planning, and mission planning was concerned about trajectories. And this trajectory we had always wanted to fly was called a free return trajectory. That means if none of the rockets fired, we had a total collapse of our propulsion, that we would be on this course where it would loop around the gravity of the moon and send us back to a safe return to the Earth's atmosphere. Now, theoretically, it's possible. Practically, how we ensured that is we would make mid-course corrections, the mid-course corrections to keep us on this path. But we ran into a big problem with that. The problem was that there was a mysterious force out there. Some hand was pushing our spacecraft away. We didn't know what it was. We checked our computer programs. Was our navigation off? We had radars that were zooming in on and measuring the trajectory as it was moving to the moon. We checked all the computations, and we couldn't figure out what this mysterious force was. It just was baffling until somebody said, you know, when we dump the wastewater, we had the problem. You know, your problem shows up after that. If we're just coasting along, you're actually falling to the moon and back. So as you're falling to the moon, it was okay. And then something would happen. But it was when we noticed it after the wastewater dump. Well, what is wastewater? Have any of you ever been camping where you have 2 or 3 people in a tent? How humid it gets? Well, imagine a spacecraft with 3 astronauts in it. They are going to give off a lot of humidity just from breathing. And humidity is not good around electronic components. So we had machinery that would squeeze the water out of the air, out of the atmosphere of the cabin. And also, we've got 3 guys, they have to urinate. So urine's quite a good part of that wastewater. So in essence, when you flush the toilet, it pushed us away. Now, do we have any engineers in here? I think we have a few, yes. Well, what would an engineer do in that situation? Well, he would figure out where's that force coming from, what direction is it in. Since it was pushing us out of our preferred trajectory, let's use that same thing to push us back into it. So as engineers are wont to do, they named this maneuver the P-dot maneuver. And for the non-engineers, it's the rate of change of P. I mentioned that the Apollo program was in a crisis. The crisis was the lunar lander was overweight by 800 pounds and underperforming. The program manager for the spacecraft said that he would told the contractors, it was mainly Grumman Aerospace that was the contractor, that he would pay up to $40,000 a pound to get weight off of the lunar module. This is the lunar module picture. And imagine that if you're trying to land with a rocket and you're on a collision course with the moon, the last thing you wanted to do is run out of fuel. Now, $40,000 a pound really equates to something close to $250,000 today. So that was big time. So the problem was handed to me and my group of guys that worked in my branch. We did a lot of computer simulations, a lot of late nights, a lot of breaking into our building at night to get access to computers, but we solved the problem. Now, it turned out that we didn't have an 800-pound weight problem. We actually had 400 pounds excess weight. We had, actually, it was, the 800 pounds was fictitious. It was really, we were right on target. We had actually could have landed another 800 pounds. But it was such a radical change from the fact that it was the #1 Apollo program problem. It was up to me to sell the solution to higher headquarters, so to speak. So I packed up my presentation charts, got on an airplane and flew to Washington, D.C. by myself. No entourage of other engineers or managers or anything. And I went to the Executive Council for the Apollo program, which are these gentlemen, Dr. George Mueller on the far left, General Sam Phillips. They've named a laboratory in Albuquerque after General Phillips. Dr. Kurt Debus, head of Kennedy Space Center.
Hold it a little farther away, it won't cut out. It's just too loud.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a little bit farther. And it
Okay,
won't cut.
thank you. Kurt Debus from the Kennedy Space Center, Dr. Robert Gilruth, who was head of my center, the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, and the famous Dr. Werner von Braun. These two gentlemen, Debus and von Braun, were former Nazis. But when I presented all my findings, all the analysis that we did, the probabilities and all that, I got a lot of questions from the group, but especially from Dr. von Braun. I guess in the back of my mind, I always felt he was kind of a figurehead, but boy, he was an engineer's engineer. He asked me very detailed questions, and I tried to answer them to the best of his ability, best of my ability, and he comprehended every bit of it. I was very impressed with him. So anyway, I get back to Houston. My boss hears I'm back in the building. He calls me up to his office. He says, give me a briefing exactly who asked what questions and also. So I went over all that. When I got done, my boss, John, said, Marlowe, I have something very important to tell you. It's been burning a hole in my soul for years. And I said, oh, what is it? He said, do you remember when you reported on duty into my branch? And I said, yeah. And I remembered I was interviewed by a guy named Morris Jenkins, who offered me a job after the interview. And when I reported to duty 2 weeks later after my transfer went through, I went to work for somebody else. Morris Jenkins wasn't even in the picture. So I figured he was reassigned or something. John told me, he said, I was out of town when you interviewed Morris. When I found out that he had offered you a job offer, and I couldn't stop the transfer because I didn't want you coming over here. He says, I was so mad at Morris, I was not going to let you work for him because you offered a job to a goddamn Italian. He assigned me to Carl Huss's section. I was dumbfounded. I was shocked. I was in a state of shock. Would you believe I never mentioned that to one living soul, not to friends, family, co-workers? I'm still in a state of shock that he said that. It wasn't until years and decades later, I was giving a talk about my experiences at NASA to a women's club in Canyon City. And I thought, I'd throw that in. And it's funny, some people just laughed out loud thinking, oh, that's funny. But I tell you what, I did not take it as a joke. No, it's not a joke. Anyhow, the first lunar landing was a heart-stopping moment for me, and I'm sure many people. Neil Armstrong was in control of the lunar lander, the picture I showed you in the previous chart. He's coming down, and the landing site that he was headed for, that he would be landing, that the computer would have landed him at, was full of boulders, as he described, the size of Volkswagens. So he chose to tip it over to fly further downrange, not let the engines throttle down. So it took him a while to go downrange to a new safe place to land. While he was doing that, the low-level light came on. There was only 60 seconds of fuel left in the tank, and I was in mission control, and I heard 60 seconds called out. And my heart stopped because I knew from all my calculations we should have plenty of fuel to land. So we landed successfully, and after we landed, when he landed, after they got out, or at the time of the landing, he said, Houston, the Eagle has landed. Very famous words. And the other famous thing he said when he stepped out on the surface of the moon is, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But I think he really intended to say, for a man, one giant leap for mankind. But the transmission was a little bit garbled. He had told his brother couple days previously at Cape Canaveral before he left that he was going to say one small step for a man. Now there's a fuel mystery here. Why did the low-level light come on and we had plenty of fuel in tanks? I'm sure you're familiar with fuel sloshing in your car tank. I mean, they put baffles in the tank to keep those gasoline from sloshing side to side and making your fuel gauge unreliable. The same thing happened on Apollo 12. We didn't have the same problem. We landed Apollo 12 next to the Lunar Explorer spacecraft, very close to it, and we did a perfect job of navigating to that point, but they had the fuel level sensor come on early. And it turns out that when I went to Bethpage, Long Island, where Grumman Aerospace was, one of the first questions when I was going over all the data that they had for me is, do you have baffles in the tank? And they said, yes, we'd have. It turns out they had anti-swirl plates to cut down, to baffle the swirling action you get in a low G environment. So they didn't want the toilet bowl problem to suck air into the engine. And that was the problem. They put the next flight was Apollo 13. They had the fuel baffles, the slosh baffles in. I'm going to talk about the lunar landing hoax theory. There's a group of people out there, the public, not by it. And the first thing I ever heard of this was the day after we landed. I'm back in Houston. Some guys come back from lunch. They went by the press center and they tell me, Marlowe, your people thinks this was a hoax. We didn't really land. It came from a Hollywood film set. And the first thing that struck me was, who is my people? Because I lived in a small community called Shore Acres next to Galveston Bay, and those people wouldn't probably, be like saying the people in Penrose think the moon is gray or made of green cheese. I mean, it just didn't compute. And I said, who are my people? And they said, the Italian press corps thinks we didn't land on the moon. Well, I thought to myself, that instant, I had seen that night before them walking around on the moon, absolutely horrible video, very low rate, frames per second, slow scan, so when people walked across the screen, you saw this smearing of the figure, low resolution. It was, in my estimation, crappy video. I think that's where it all started, when people said, it can't be from the moon. Because we had a video camera in the spacecraft going to the moon. It was color. You could see people's faces, and pretty high resolution for the time. Now, one of the things about the lunar landing hoax is the theory is that a small group of people, higher ups in the administration or the CIA or the Illuminati or some world organization faked this, and the 400,000 people that were working on the Apollo program, they had no knowledge of it. They just busily thinking we're going to send something to the moon. Now, in his memoirs after he left office, President Bill Clinton stated that when he was a young man, he believed we landed on the moon. He saw it on television and everything. But when he became president and realized how the government really worked, he thought, we never landed on the moon, or I've got pretty serious doubts we did, because this group of people here could easily have rigged it. Now, my question is, if it was rigged, how did they know that there was not anti-slosh baffles in the fuel tanks on the lunar lander that would cause the low-level light to come on early? Because it happened on 2 flights. Until we fixed it, then it didn't happen anymore. So those people had to be not only super smart in how they figured this thing out and fooled the public, but they also had to be clairvoyant too, because they probably didn't know about the fuel slosh problem. Also, astronaut Brian O'Leary, who was at NASA to train for a Mars mission with another group of astronauts, he left the program, and in his memoirs, he said, I don't believe we ever landed on the moon. I don't think that ever happened. I'll end this with some funny facts and figures that you probably don't find in the textbooks. Buzz Aldrin should have been the first man to land on the moon. Why do I say that? Think of the spacecraft that landed on the moon as being the front seat of your car. You're the driver, that's Neil Armstrong landing the craft, but his door is not a door. It's a hard, like it was welded shut. He can't exit from his left side. Buzz Aldrin is standing, by the way, they're not sitting down, they're standing as they land on the moon, is standing next to him. The airlock in the door is on his side. Now they're in what's called shirt sleeve environment. They're not in a hard space suit. So in order to go onto the moon, they got to put these suits on. It would be logical for Aldrin to suit up first, Aldrin suit up, and then make an exit with Aldrin leaving the spacecraft first. And that's what was pitched to NASA management. NASA said, wait a minute, Neil Armstrong is the commander of the mission. He's got to be the first one to step on the moon. Not the second guy, not the co-pilot, the pilot. And so they figured out a complicated kabuki dance of how they get suited up and change positions and all that so that Neil could go out the airlock first. People don't know about that. I mentioned the Apollo 8 mission. There was rumors that the Soviets were going to fly to the moon. They literally sent their manned space rated vehicle to fly around the moon, just like Apollo 8, and come back, and they had a live tortoise on board. So they had the life support system to keep a turtle alive, and they brought it back successfully. And that was in September. We flew Apollo 8 several months later in December. We never said the word NASA. We never said it. We always would say NASA. In fact, it wasn't until my secretary brought in a radio and we were listening to the coverage of one of the Gemini missions that I heard one of the reporters, actually she had a TV set, one of the TV reporters referred to Nassau. And I thought, Nassau in the Bahamas, we're not even close to there. Our orbit has taken us over the Indian Ocean. You know, it was like, what was happening in Nassau? And then I realized, and she says, oh, they're calling us Nassau now. I said, well, that's crazy. There's a story behind that. I won't bore you with why we said NASA. And that, my friends, is the end of the story. Thank you.